The late afternoon sun slanted across the parking lot of a grocery store in Burlington, Vermont, casting long shadows between the parked cars. A man in his mid-30s knelt beside a
Looks like the
stalled
alternator might be
luxury
the issue.
sedan,
See
his
this belt here?
calloused
It's not
hands
spinning
working
right.
beneath the
Can we
open
fix it
hood
ourselves,
while
or
the
should we
engine
call for help?
ticked in the cooling air. The Mercedes was black expensive and clearly not from around here. He'd seen plenty like it over the years. Summer people executives passing through the occasional trust fund kid slumming it in New England before heading back to wherever money went when it wanted to feel rustic. Ethan Morrison didn't look up when the driver's door opened. He'd learned years ago that looking made people think you cared about their schedule, their problems, their whole self-important universe. The alternator belt had snapped clean through, probably from deferred maintenance, and he was halfway to confirming the diagnosis when heels clicked against the asphalt with the particular rhythm of impatience. The voice came sharp, professional, used to being heard. "How long will this take? I have a conference call in 20 minutes. He answered without raising his head, tone flat as the Vermont horizon. "It's done when it's done." The response earned him silence, which suited him fine. His hands traced the serpentine belt path, checking for debris, for anything else that might fail the moment this woman drove off into whatever crisis justified that tone. The work required attention. The work always required attention, and attention was something he'd gotten good at rationing over the past 12 years. When he finally stood and reached for the rag tucked into his back pocket, the movement brought him into the sun's direct path. Light hit his face at an angle that revealed the small scar running along his left hand. The one that ached sometimes before rain, the one that reminded him every single day what happened when you weren't careful about who you trusted with your future. He wiped his hands methodically, not looking at the woman, not needing to. She was just another customer in a long line of people who needed something fixed and had money to make that happen. He'd replace the belt, charge her the standard rate, and she'd disappear back into whatever world spawned women in charcoal suits and Italian leather shoes in a town where most people wore Carhartt and work boots. But then she made a sound. Not a cough or a sigh, but something smaller, something that caught in her throat like a word that had been waiting 12 years to escape. His hands stilled against the rag. The woman took a half step forward, and her voice, when it came, was completely different from the executive snap of 30 seconds ago. Quieter, uncertain, afraid almost in a way that made something cold crawl up his spine. She said a name. Not his name, not the one printed on the garage sign or the driver's license in his wallet, but a nickname. A word that belonged to summer nights and promises made on a porch swing when the world had seemed full of possibility instead of just work and bills and making sure Harper ate her vegetables. Ace. The rag dropped from Ethan's hands. His jaw locked tight enough to hurt something slamming shut behind his eyes before anyone could see what lived there. The word hung in the air between them, impossible, unwanted, carrying the weight of everything he'd spent a decade trying to bury under honest work and the simple mathematics of survival. He forced himself to look at her, then really look, and the face that met his gaze was both familiar and foreign. The bones were the same, the high cheekbones, the shape of her mouth, the way her eyes tilted slightly at the corners. But time had carved changes he hadn't been there to witness. Fine lines at the corners of her eyes, a hardness around her mouth that hadn't existed when she was 23 and laughing in the summer twilight. The tailored suit and pulled-back hair and $300 shoes that screamed money in a way that made his garage-stained hands feel like exactly what they were. She was older. They both were. But she was unmistakably the same person who'd walked out of his life without a word, without an explanation, leaving nothing but swints and the wreckage of every plan he'd ever made. Elena Wells, standing in a grocery store parking lot in Burlington like she had any right to be there. Like she had any right to say that name. His voice came out flat, deliberately empty, giving her nothing she could use. "You've got the wrong person." Her eyes widened slightly, something cracking in that professional facade. She took another step closer and he could see her hands were shaking. Just barely, but they were shaking. "Ace," she said again, louder this time, testing whether the word would break the spell or confirm it. "It's me. I said you've got the wrong person." He cut her off before she could finish, before she could say her own name, like it meant something, like it had ever meant anything except pain and humiliation, and the slow understanding that some people were never coming back. "That'll be $40 for the alternator belt. You can pay inside." He turned and walked toward his truck without waiting for a response. His gait was unhurried but definite, the walk of a man who'd said everything he intended to say, and had absolutely no interest in hearing what came next. The truck sat at the far end of the lot, dusty and practical, the kind of vehicle that carried tools and parts and occasionally a 7-year-old who liked to pretend the front seat was a spaceship. Behind him, he could feel her standing there, not following, not calling out, just standing in the space where their conversation had ended, where he'd ended it, where it needed to stay, ended for everyone's sake. The truck door opened with its familiar creak. He climbed in, turned the key, and pulled out of the lot without looking back. Without checking the rearview mirror, without doing anything that might suggest the past 20 minutes had been anything other than a standard roadside repair. But his hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and that nickname kept echoing in his skull all the way back to the garage, clinging to him like the scent of rain on dry earth, like something he couldn't quite wash off no matter how hard he tried. Inside the sedan, Elena's hands found the steering wheel and gripped until her knuckles turned white. The engine purred smoothly now, repaired by the very hands that had once held hers in the darkness of a Vermont summer night back when the world had been small enough to fit inside two people and the future had stretched out like an open road. 12 years. It had been 12 years since she'd seen his face, heard his voice, felt the particular weight of his presence beside her. 12 years since she'd built an entire life in his absence. Climbing corporate ladders and shattering glass ceilings, accumulating wealth and influence, and all the markers of success her father had promised would make her happy. None of it had. None of it had even come close. She pressed her forehead against the cool leather and forced herself to breathe. In and out, in and out. Trying to slow the racing of her thoughts, trying to process what had just happened and what it meant, and whether she'd just made the biggest mistake of her already mistake-riddled life. The memory came unbidden, sharp as broken glass. 12 years ago, when they were both 23 and stupid with it. When Ethan Morrison had been the son of a local garage owner working his way through engineering school on a full scholarship, his hands already skilled at coaxing life from dead engines. When she had been the daughter of Christopher Wells, CEO of Wells Industries, spending her summer in Burlington at her father's Vermont office, while pretending she cared about mergers and acquisitions instead of the boy who could make anything run with enough patience and the right tools. They'd met when her father brought his Bentley in for service. Ethan had been the one to diagnose the problem of failing fuel pump that 3 other mechanics had missed. She'd watched him work, fascinated by the quiet competence, the way his hands moved with purpose, the complete absence of pretense. He'd looked at her when he was done, really looked, and something had shifted in the air between them. The first date had been her idea. Coffee at a diner downtown, nothing fancy, just talking. The second had been his, a drive to Lake Champlain, spreading a blanket on the shore, watching the sun set, while he explained how internal combustion worked with a passion that made her forget she was supposed to care about quarterly earnings. By the 3rd week, she'd been in love, completely, irrevocably, in the way you could only be when you were young enough to believe love conquered everything, including fathers who thought mechanic sons weren't good enough for their daughters. They'd kept it secret, met at the lake at quiet diners in neighboring towns, on the porch swing behind his mother's house, where the fireflies came out thick as stews. He told her about his plans, how the scholarship would take him to MIT, how he'd come back to Burlington eventually and open his own shop, how he'd build something that mattered with his hands and his brain, and his refusal to give up on problems everyone else called impossible. She'd told him about her plans too, though they'd sounded hollow even then. Law school probably, or an MBA. Whatever her father decided would best serve the family business. Whatever would make her indispensable to an empire she'd never asked to inherit. "You could do something else," Ethan had said one night, fireflies drifting around them like pieces of captured starlight. "You could do anything you wanted." And she'd believed him. For exactly 8 more days she'd believed him. The morning they'd come for her, the sun hadn't even risen. Her father's driver had appeared at the Burlington house with a suitcase already packed, clothes she didn't remember choosing folded with military precision. Her father's voice on the phone had been calm. Final, the tone he used when a decision was made and discussion was pointless. "We're leaving, now. There will be no arguments." She'd tried anyway, demanded to know why, demanded time to say goodbye, demanded anything except this abrupt severance, this surgical removal from a life she'd only just begun to build. Her father had been unmoved. "This summer experiment is over, Elena. You have responsibilities. You have a future that doesn't involve wasting time in a provincial town with people who will never understand our world." She'd written the note in the car hands. Shaking so badly the words came out barely legible. Explained everything: the forced departure, her father's ultimatum, her absolute certainty that this wasn't her choice. Begged Ethan to understand, to wait, to believe that she would find a way back as soon as she figured out how to fight her father's control without losing everything. She'd made the driver stop 3 blocks from Ethan's mother's house. Had run to the door in the pre-dawn darkness and slipped the envelope under it, pressing her palm flat against the wood like she could somehow transmit through it everything she didn't have words for. Then she'd waited. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. She'd checked her email obsessively, her phone, even the physical mailbox at her father's Manhattan penthouse. On the off chance Ethan didn't trust electronic communication. She'd held on to the certainty that he would reach out once he'd read the note, once he understood, once the initial hurt had faded enough for him to hear what she'd been trying to say. The silence had been absolute. Eventually she'd understood. He'd read the note and decided she wasn't worth the effort. He'd read about her father and her responsibilities and her complicated future and concluded that whatever they'd had in Burlington wasn't strong enough to survive in the real world. She'd told herself it was better this way, cleaner. He would move on, she would move on, and in 10 or 20 years they'd both look back on that summer as a pleasant memory rather than something that had shaped the architecture of their entire lives. But now, sitting in a grocery store parking lot with her hands trembling on a steering wheel repaired by those same careful hands, she understood something far more devastating. He'd never received the note. 12 years of silence. 12 years of believing he'd chosen to let her go. And all of it built on a lie. Her father had intercepted it. Had to have. Christopher Wells didn't leave loose ends, didn't permit variables he couldn't control. A note from his daughter to a mechanic's son explaining why she'd vanished. Of course he'd made sure it never arrived. Of course he'd guaranteed that Ethan would think she'd simply abandoned him without a word, without an explanation, without any indication that their time together had meant anything at all. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She gripped the steering wheel harder, fighting back tears she hadn't allowed herself to cry in over a decade. Every assumption she'd made, every rationalization, every late-night justification she'd used to ease her guilt about moving on while Ethan presumably did the same. All of it rested on a letter that had never reached its destination. And now Ethan thought she was exactly what her father had wanted him to think, someone who could walk away from love without looking back. Ethan drove through the darkening streets toward the garage with the radio off and the windows down, letting the evening air clear some of the chaos from his head. Harper would be waiting for him there, probably sitting on the counter with a coloring book, swinging her legs and asking Marcus why the sk changed colors at sunset. The thought of her face, her gap-toothed stool, her absolute certainty that her father could fix anything. It was the only thing that kept him grounded when the rest of the world threatened to spin out of control. He pulled into the gravel lot and cut the engine, but didn't get out immediately. Just sat there in the cab's familiar darkness, staring at the scar on his left hand. It had faded over the years, but he could still trace its path from memory, still feel the phantom pain of the accident that had left it there. The accident that had taken everything from him. His scholarship, his future, his faith in the fundamental fairness of the world. And now Elena had reappeared, conjured out of nowhere like a ghost from a life he'd spent 12 years trying to bury. He didn't know what game she was playing, and he didn't want to find out. Through the garage's bay windows, he could see Harper's silhouette perched on the front counter, exactly where he'd known she would be. Marcus stood nearby, probably explaining something about carburetors or the internal combustion cycle, because Marcus believed 7-year-olds were perfectly capable of understanding how things worked if you just broke it down into simple enough pieces. Ethan climbed out of the truck and headed inside, shoving everything about parking lots and nicknames and ghosts into the locked box where he kept all the things that didn't help him be the father Harper deserved. The bell over the door chimed as he entered. Harper's head snapped up, her whole face lighting with the kind of uncomplicated joy that reminded him why nothing else mattered. "Daddy." She scrambled down from the counter, sneakers hitting the concrete with a thud, already running toward him. "Did you fix the fancy car?" He caught her as she launched herself at him, lifting her up with the ease of practice, feeling some of the tension drain from his shoulders as her small arms wrapped around his neck. This was real. This was what counted. "Yeah, baby," he said into her honey blonde hair, which smelled like the strawberry shampoo she insisted on using. "All fixed." She pulled back to look at him with those eyes that were exactly like his, brown and serious and far too observant for a 7-year-old. Her mind was already 3 questions ahead, the way it always was. Why do rich people always have fancy cars? Ethan set her down and crouched to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. This was the kind of question Harper asked. Not simple, not easy, the kind that required real answers, because she could tell when he was giving her a line. Because they can afford them, sweetheart. Harper's nose wrinkled the way it did when an answer didn't quite satisfy her curiosity. But if the cars break all the time, are they actually good cars? Behind them, Marcus let out a bark of laughter. The older man stood by the register, arms crossed, weathered face creased with amusement. At 52, Marcus Flynn had been working on engines since before Ethan was born. First in the Navy, then in civilian garages up and down the East Coast before settling in Burlington 5 years ago. He'd become more than a business partner. More than a friend, really. The closest thing to a father figure Ethan had let himself trust since his own dad died. "Kid's got a point," Marcus said, his voice carrying the rough edges of too many years breathing exhaust fumes. "Mercedes electronics are a nightmare." Ethan straightened, ruffling Harper's hair. "That's because fancy doesn't always mean smart, kiddo. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one." Harper nodded like he'd just revealed a profound truth, then bounced back toward the counter where her coloring book lay open to a half-finished drawing of what might have been a rocket ship or possibly a very elaborate sandwich. "When I grow up," she announced, climbing back onto her perch, "I'm gonna have a fancy car and know how to fix it." Something warm expanded in Ethan's chest, pushing back against the cold that had been there since the parking lot. His daughter. 7 years old and already understanding that knowing how things worked mattered more than just owning them. Already grasping principles it had taken him years to learn. Marcus moved closer, voice dropping to a register meant only for Ethan. "You okay? You look like you saw a ghost." The observation was too close to accurate. Ethan grabbed a shop rag from the counter and made a show of wiping down already clean hands, not meeting Marcus's eyes. "Just a long day." Marcus made a sound that suggested he knew exactly how full of shit that answer was, but he didn't push. That was the thing about Marcus. He'd been around long enough to know when someone needed space, when pressing for details would just make them shut down harder. "Harper ate the sandwich I brought," Marcus said, instead switching topics with the smooth efficiency of someone well-practiced in giving people room to breathe. "Apples, too. Tried to convince me she needed ice cream for a balanced dinner." "I said it had calcium," Harper called from the counter without looking up from her coloring. "So does cheese," Ethan called back, "which you're having with your pasta tonight." Harper sighed with the deep tragedy of a child denied dessert before dinner but didn't argue further. She knew the rules, knew her father loved her enough to mean what he said. Ethan glanced at the clock on the wall. Nearly 6. Time to close up, head home, get Harper fed and bathed and tucked into bed with whatever story she picked tonight. Time to return to the reliable rhythms of routine where everything made sense because he'd designed it to make sense, where nothing unexpected could slip through the cracks and remind him that the world was bigger and messier than the small, safe corner he'd carved out. "Go grab your backpack," he told Harper, "and say thank you to Marcus for watching you. Thank you for watching me and teaching me about fuel injection," Harper recited, sliding off the counter and heading for the small office where her school things lived during afternoon hours. "She's a good kid," Marcus said quietly once she was out of earshot. "You're doing something right." The compliment sat heavier than it should have. Ethan had spent 7 years trying to do everything right by Harper, trying to be enough parent for two, trying to make sure she never felt the absence of the mother who'd walked out when she was barely old enough to remember. "She makes it easy," he said, which was true. Harper had always been easy, curious, affectionate, resilient in ways that made his heart hurt with how much she didn't know about how hard life could be. Marcus hesitated like he wanted to say something else, but Harper came bouncing back with her pink backpack, and the moment passed. They said their goodbyes. Ethan locked up the garage and father and daughter headed out to the truck under a sky that had gone deep purple with approaching night. The drive home was short, just 10 minutes through quiet residential streets to the modest cottage Ethan had bought 3 years ago. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that had needed significant repair work when he'd moved in, but it was theirs. Paid for with money he'd earned with his own hands, every mortgage payment a small victory against the idea that he needed anyone's help to build a life worth living. Inside, the familiar routine took over. Harper dumped her backpack by the door, kicked off her shoes, and headed straight for the small table where she did homework while Ethan cooked. Tonight she had spelling words to practice and a math worksheet that shouldn't take more than 20 minutes. He put water on to boil and pulled the ingredients for pasta from the cupboard, moving through the motions with the muscle memory of hundreds of similar evenings. This was good. This was stable. This was exactly what he and Harper needed. But underneath the normalcy, underneath the reliable rhythm of slice and dice and stir, his mind kept circling back to the parking lot, to Elena standing there in her expensive suit saying a name no one had called him in over a decade, to the way his hands had frozen when he heard it, like his body remembered even if he'd spent years training his mind to forget. "Daddy," Harper's voice cut through his thoughts, "you're cutting the tomatoes really tiny." He looked down. She was right. The tomatoes had been reduced to something approaching pulp. "Guess I was thinking about something else." he said, scraping the over-chopped vegetables into the pan anyway. About what? About the way some things could be buried but never truly gone. About how the past had a way of showing up in grocery store parking lots even when you'd done everything in your power to make sure it stayed dead. But Harper was 7. She didn't need to know about any of that. About whether you finished your spelling words, he said instead, pointing at her worksheet with the wooden spoon. She wrinkled her nose but bent back to her work, and Ethan turned back to the stove, letting the simple mechanics of cooking pull him back to center. After dinner came bath time, then story time, then the elaborate ritual of tucked blankets and nightlights and checking under the bed for monsters that both of them knew didn't exist but checked for anyway because the ritual mattered more than the logic. "I love you, Daddy," Harper said when he finally kissed her forehead and stood to leave. "I love you too, baby. Sleep tight." "Tight as a drum," she responded, completing their nightly call in response with a sleepy smile. Ethan closed her door and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to her settle into sleep, feeling the fierce protectiveness that rose in him whenever he thought about how small she still was. How much of the world could hurt her if he wasn't careful. Then he went out to the porch. The night air had gone cool, carrying the scent of pine from the woods that bordered his property. He grabbed a beer from the fridge on his way out, twisted the cap off, and settled into the old wooden chair that had been there when he bought the place. Stars were coming out now, scattered across the sky in patterns he'd learned to recognize over years of sitting here after Harper went to bed, working through the day's problems in the quiet dark. But tonight the quiet didn't help. Tonight, no matter how hard he tried to focus on anything else, his mind kept returning to one word. Ace. Only one person had ever called him that. Only Elena, who'd given him the nickname during their second week together, laughing when he'd fixed her father's car faster than the dealership had estimated, saying he was good at everything he tried. "You're like an ace," she'd said. "You know, like in cards, the best one." He'd rolled his eyes at the time, told her it was corny, but she'd kept using it anyway. Private just between them, a word that meant they had something no one else could touch. And then she'd left. No warning, no explanation. One day she'd been there, the next day gone, her father's summer house empty and locked up tight. He'd driven by it for weeks looking for signs of life before finally accepting that she wasn't coming back. He'd tried to convince himself it didn't matter, that it had been a summer thing, nothing more. That she'd probably met someone more appropriate, someone who went to the right schools and had the right last name and didn't smell like motor oil at the end of every workday. But it had mattered. It had mattered enough that when the accident happened 3 months later, when a delivery truck ran a red light and T-boned his car with his mother in the passenger seat, he'd had no one to call, no one to talk to through the worst days of his life except Marcus. And he hadn't even met Marcus yet back then. The accident had destroyed more than his scholarship. It had destroyed the person he'd been planning to become. MIT had rescinded their offer not officially because of the accident, but because of the whispers that had followed it. Whispers about reckless driving, about a kid who'd been going too fast, too careless, who'd caused his own mother's injuries through sheer negligence. None of it had been true. The police report had cleared him completely. Witness statements confirmed the other driver had blown through the intersection. Insurance had paid out after a lengthy investigation that found Ethan entirely without fault. But the whispers had persisted anyway because some people needed someone to blame, and a 23-year-old mechanic's son made an easier target than a company driver rushing to meet an impossible deadline. By the time the truth had been fully established, MIT had already filled his scholarship spot. Other schools had heard the rumors and quietly withdrawn their interest. Doors had closed with some final clicks, and Ethan had found himself trapped in Burlington, with a recovering mother mounting medical bills in a future that looked nothing like the one he'd planned. He'd rebuilt, slowly, painfully, one careful choice at a time. taken over his father's garage when the old man's heart gave out. Met Vanessa 2 years later, a relationship born more from loneliness than love. Married her when she got pregnant because it seemed like the right thing to do. Loved Harper from the moment she was born with a fierceness that surprised him. And then Vanessa had left, too unable to handle the modest life Ethan offered, unwilling to settle for a small house and a small town when she'd convinced herself she deserved more. So he'd raised Harper alone, built a reputation for honest work and fair prices, created a life that was stable and predictable and safe from the kind of chaos that came from trusting people who could walk away without looking back. And now Elena Wells had appeared in a parking lot saying a name that belonged to a version of himself he'd buried under a decade of scar tissue, and expecting what? Forgiveness, understanding, some kind of closure that would let her feel better about the choice she'd made 12 years ago. Ethan took a long pull from his beer and stared at the stars. He wasn't that person anymore. Wasn't the kid who'd believed in summer romance and second chances. He was a father now, a business owner, someone who understood that you survived by protecting what mattered and refusing to let anyone close enough to hurt you again. Tomorrow Elena would probably come by the garage. Try to explain, try to make him understand whatever justified her sudden reappearance. And tomorrow he'd make it clear that the past was staying buried where it belonged. An hour later, and 10 miles across town, Elena still sat in her car. The parking lot had emptied around her as the sun set, and the grocery store closed, leaving her alone with the engine's idle purr and the weight of 12 years pressing down on her chest. She should drive back to the hotel, should shower and change and prepare for tomorrow's meetings about the merger her father had sent her here to oversee. Should focus on the work that had always been her refuge from complicated feelings and impossible situations. Instead, her hand reached down, almost of its own accord, fingers brushing against something unfamiliar on the passenger side floor mat. A wallet. Brown leather worn at the edges, lying exactly where it must have fallen when Ethan had leaned across to check her engine. Elena picked it up with trembling hands. This was wrong. She knew it was wrong. This was Ethan's property, his privacy, and she had no right to open it. But 12 years of wondering what became of him won out over 12 years of corporate ethics training. The wallet opened to reveal a Vermont driver's license behind a clear plastic sleeve. Ethan Morrison, it confirmed, Burlington address she didn't recognize, expiration date 3 years out, and behind it, visible through the plastic, a photograph. The image was simple, candid Ethan sitting on porch steps with a little girl wrapped in his arm. The child was grinning at the camera with that unself-conscious joy only children could manage. Honey blonde hair catching the sunlight, eyes squinted nearly shut with the force of her smile. And Ethan was looking at her with an expression of such profound tenderness that Elena felt something crack open in the center of her chest. This was not the cold, closed-off man from the parking lot. This was someone capable of deep love, deep connection, deep care for another human being. This was the Ethan she remembered, the one who'd explained fuel injection systems with the patience of a born teacher, who'd listened to her complaints about her father's expectations without trying to fix them, just holding space for her frustration, who'd kissed her for the first time under a sky full of stars and made her believe that maybe life could be more than quarterly reports and shareholder meetings. He'd survived without her, built a life, became a father, and she'd spent 12 years in corporate boardrooms telling herself that success was enough, that the hollow feeling in her chest would eventually fill with something other than the ghost of what she'd lost. Elena stared at the photograph until her vision blurred, until she couldn't tell where the tears ended and the image began. All those years of wondering what became of him, whether he'd found happiness, whether he'd moved on the way she'd never quite managed to. Here was the answer clutched in her shaking hands. He had survived. He had kept going. He had found something worth living for, and she was about to disrupt all of it by wading back into his life without an invitation. The responsible thing would be to leave the wallet at the garage tomorrow morning with a note. To let him live the peaceful existence he'd clearly built from the rubble of whatever had happened after she'd disappeared. To accept that some doors once closed were meant to stay that way. But Elena had spent 12 years being responsible. 12 years making the choices her father approved of, building the career he'd designed for her, becoming exactly the person Christopher Wells wanted his daughter to be. And she was so tired of it. Tired of pretending the hollow feeling would ever fill. Tired of lying to herself that one more promotion, one more successful merger, one more step up the corporate ladder would somehow compensate for the fact that she'd walked away from the only person who'd ever made her feel like herself. Tomorrow she would return the wallet, would insist on speaking to him properly, not in a parking lot where he could walk away, but somewhere he'd have to listen. Would tell him the truth about the letter, about her father, about the 12 years she'd spent believing he'd chosen to let her go. And if he still wanted her gone after that, if he still looked at her with those kind eyes and told her to leave, then at least she'd know she'd tried. At least she'd know she'd fought for something that mattered instead of just accepting whatever her father decided was best. Elena carefully placed the wallet on the passenger seat and finally started the car. The hotel was downtown, close to her father's Burlington office. The kind of place that catered to business travelers with its beige walls and impersonal efficiency. She drove there on autopilot, checked in, went through the motions of unpacking her suitcase and laying out tomorrow's clothes. But her mind was already mapping out what she'd say when she saw Ethan again. How do you apologize for 12 years? How do you explain that you'd tried to do the right thing? That you'd left a note, that you'd waited for a response that never came because someone else had decided your love story didn't fit into their vision for your future? How do you ask for forgiveness when you're not sure you deserve it? The next morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. Elena dressed in another suit, navy, this time paired with heels that made her feel armored against whatever was coming. She grabbed the wallet from her hotel room desk where she'd left it, tucking it into her bag like evidence of something she couldn't quite name. Morrison's Auto Repair opened at 8. She arrived at 8:15 when the morning rush would be over. But before lunch, crowds started thinking about oil changes and tire rotations. The garage was exactly what she'd expected, a low building with 3 bay doors, all of them open to reveal concrete floors stained with years of oil and grease. Tools hung on pegboards in careful organization. A radio played classic rock at low volume. The air smelled like motor oil and metal and honest work. 2 younger mechanics worked on cars in the far bays, but her attention went straight to the vintage Ford in the center bay where Ethan lay on a creeper beneath the chassis, only his legs visible. An older man stood near the register, early 50s, weathered in the way of people who'd spent their lives working with their hands. He looked up when she entered, taking in her suit and heels with an expression that suggested he'd already categorized her as someone who didn't belong here. Before he could speak, the conversation in the garage stopped, completely. The younger mechanics froze mid-motion. The man by the register cleared his throat in a way that carried warning, and Ethan Morrison slid out from beneath the Ford. He was wearing jeans and a work shirt with his name embroidered over the pocket, both marked with the day's first round of stains. His expression when he saw her was utterly unreadable, not surprised, not angry, just blank in a way that felt worse than hostility. He stood slowly, reached for a rag, wiped his hands with methodical care. Each movement deliberate, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. And she was just another customer waiting for service. Elena's prepared speech evaporated. She'd practiced on the drive over, worked out exactly what to say and how to say it. But standing here in his workspace with his employees watching and that blank expression offering her nothing to work with, all her carefully chosen words felt inadequate. She held out the wallet instead, her gesture uncertain in a way that had nothing to do with her usual corporate confidence. "I found this in my car. Thought you might be looking for it." Ethan crossed the space between them and took the wallet without their fingers touching. He opened it with the same methodical care he'd applied to the rag, checking the contents like he was cataloging evidence rather than verifying his own belongings. His voice when he spoke was flat, professionally polite. "Thanks." One word, nothing else. Just thanks, like she was a stranger who'd performed a minor courtesy. He turned away and Elena felt the conversation ending before it had really started. Felt the door she'd been hoping to pry open slamming shut with that single syllable. She didn't leave. She stood there in Morrison's auto repair, surrounded by the tools of Ethan's trade, refusing to accept that this was all she'd get. Her eyes searched his face for some crack in the armor, some sign that underneath the professional courtesy lived the person who'd once loved her enough to plan a future around her. Her gaze dropped to the wallet still in his hands, and the words came out before she could stop them. "You have a daughter now." It wasn't a question, just a statement carrying the weight of everything she'd seen in that photograph, everything it represented about the life he'd built without her. Something flickered across Ethan's face so fast she almost missed it. His composure cracked for just half a second, and she saw through to the vulnerability underneath. Saw that despite all his efforts to remain detached, there was one subject he couldn't discuss with clinical distance. He tucked the wallet into his back pocket and met her eyes, and for the first time since the parking lot there was real emotion there. Defensive, protective, warning her off territory she had no right to enter. "That's none of your business." The words came out cold, but underneath them she heard something else. Fear. Not of her, but of what her presence represented. The possibility of disruption, of chaos entering the careful order he'd constructed. Elena didn't retreat. She'd spent 12 years retreating from difficult conversations, accepting her father's decisions without pushing back, choosing the path of least resistance over the path that led toward what she actually wanted. She was done retreating. She nodded slowly, accepting the boundary he'd drawn while making clear she wasn't ready to walk away entirely. "I'm staying in town for a few weeks. Business matters at my father's headquarters." She kept her voice casual, conversational, but they both knew what she was really saying. She would be around. She wasn't disappearing this time. If he wanted to avoid her, he'd have to work at it. Ethan's response was silence. Arms folded across his chest, expression locked down again, giving her nothing. Behind him, the older mechanic watched with undisguised curiosity. The younger ones had returned to their work but were clearly listening. Elena held Ethan's gaze for another moment, then turned and walked toward the entrance. But at the threshold where fluorescent garage light met morning sun, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. Her expression had changed. The corporate mask she'd worn into the building had fallen away, revealing something raw underneath. Something that looked like regret and determination mixed in equal measure, something that suggested she'd come here prepared to fight for what she needed, even if it cost her everything. Then she was gone, and the garage erupted in whispered speculation. "Who was that?" one of the younger mechanics asked. Ethan didn't answer, just silenced them with a single sharp look that made clear the subject was closed, then returned to the Ford and slid back under the chassis. But his hands weren't as steady as they'd been before, and somewhere in the dim recesses of his chest, a door he'd thought permanently sealed was rattling against its hinges, threatening to burst open despite every lock he'd installed to keep it shut. 2 days passed, then 3. Ethan kept expecting Elena to reappear, to show up at the garage with more explanations or demands or whatever agenda had brought her back to Burlington. But she didn't come, which should have been a relief. Should have meant he could return to the comfortable rhythms of work and fatherhood without the disruption of unwanted history resurfacing. Instead, he found himself distracted, making small mistakes, grabbing the wrong wrench, miscalculating torque specifications, losing track of conversations mid-sentence. Marcus noticed but didn't comment, just watched him with that quiet concern that somehow made it worse. On Wednesday afternoon, when the garage was quiet and Harper was at school, Ethan finally allowed himself to acknowledge what had been gnawing at him since that parking lot encounter. Elena hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. She was here on business, her father's business, which meant Wells Industries. Which meant she had a reason to be in Burlington that had nothing to do with ancient history or unfinished conversations. It should have made him feel better. Should have confirmed that her presence was coincidental, that she'd been just as surprised as he was by their accidental meeting. But it didn't. Because coincidence or not, she'd still said his nickname. Still looked at him like she had some kind of right to the past they'd shared. Still refused to just walk away when he'd made it clear her presence wasn't welcome. He was elbow-deep in an engine rebuild when the bay door darkened with a new arrival. Ethan didn't look up. Customers could wait until he reached a stopping point. The camshaft positioning required precision, and he'd already had to restart twice because his concentration kept drifting. But then he heard the particular click of expensive heels on concrete, and his hands stilled against the engine block. When he finally slid out from under the hood, Elena was standing just inside the garage entrance, backlit by afternoon sun. She was holding 2 cups of coffee from the shop across the street, her expression uncertain in a way that didn't match the confidence of her tailored clothes. "I thought maybe we could talk," she said. Ethan straightened from the engine bay, wiping his hands on a rag that had already seen too much use today. The coffee cups in Elena's hands looked out of place in the industrial setting, their white paper sleeves too clean against the background of grease-stained tools and concrete floors scarred by decades of dropped parts. He glanced toward the office where Marcus had conveniently found paperwork to review, leaving them alone in a gesture so obvious it would have been funny under different circumstances. "I'm working," Ethan said, his tone offering no encouragement. Elena took another step inside her heels, clicking softly. "I know, I can come back later if..." "There's no good time for this conversation." She flinched slightly but didn't retreat. Instead, she set both coffee cups on the workbench beside his tools, positioning them carefully away from the open parts organizer. The gesture was oddly domestic, like she belonged here, like she had any right to navigate his workspace. "Please. 5 minutes." The word please landed with unexpected weight. Elena Wells didn't strike him as someone who begged often. The corporate confidence she'd worn like armor in the parking lot had developed visible cracks, and underneath it, he could see something that looked uncomfortably close to desperation. Against his better judgment, Ethan found himself nodding toward the small bench outside the bay doors where employees took smoke breaks. Not inside the garage where Marcus could overhear. Not somewhere enclosed where he'd feel trapped. Just 5 minutes in the open air where he could walk away whenever this became more than he could handle. They settled onto the bench with careful distance between them, Elena perched on the edge like she might need to run, Ethan sprawled with the studied casualness of someone determined not to show how much this cost him. For a long moment, neither spoke. A truck rumbled past on the street. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Normal sounds from a normal afternoon in a normal town where ghosts from the past didn't show up with coffee and apologies. Elena broke first. "I need to know something. You need a lot of things doesn't mean I'm giving them to you." She absorbed the hit without visible reaction, though her knuckles whitened where they gripped the coffee cup she'd kept. "That morning I left, 12 years ago. Did you get my note?" There it was. The question that had apparently brought her here, that had driven her to track him down and invade his carefully constructed life. Ethan could have lied, could have told her yes, he'd gotten it, read it, and decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Could have ended this conversation with a single word that would send her back to wherever she'd come from. But something in her face stopped him. Some quality of genuine uncertainty that suggested she actually didn't know the answer. That this wasn't manipulation or game playing, but a real question with real stakes. His voice, when it came, was quiet, stripped of the defensive edge. There was no note. Elena's cup slipped from her fingers. Coffee splashed across the pavement, dark liquid spreading in an irregular stain that would dry by evening and leave no trace it had ever existed. She didn't seem to notice. Her whole body had gone still, rigid with the kind of shock that came from having a fundamental assumption ripped away. "My father?" she said so quietly he almost missed it. He must have intercepted it. Ethan had spent 12 years assuming Elena had walked away without looking back. 12 years building his understanding of her character around that single act of abandonment. 12 years telling himself that people from her world didn't mix with people from his. That summer romances were just that he'd been a fool to think otherwise. And now she was sitting here saying that everything he'd believed might have been built on someone else's lie. He should have felt vindication, should have felt anger at Christopher Wells for manipulating them both, should have felt something other than this hollow sense of time wasted, of years spent hating someone for a choice she might never have made. What did the note say? The question came out rougher than he'd intended. Elena's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. That I didn't want to leave, that my father gave me no choice, that I would find a way back as soon as I could figure out how to fight him without losing everything. She paused, swallowing hard. That I loved you enough to try. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Ethan wasn't ready to examine. Loved, past tense. A thing that had existed 12 years ago when they were both young enough to believe love conquered logistics and family expectations, and the fundamental incompatibility of their worlds. Why did he do it? Ethan heard himself ask. Why did he care so much about keeping us apart? Elena's laugh came out bitter, nothing like the sound he remembered from summer nights. Because you weren't good enough. Not in his eyes. You were a mechanic's son from a small town working your way through school on scholarship. I was supposed to marry someone with the right name, the right connections, the right pedigree. Her voice cracked slightly. Someone who would benefit the family empire instead of threatening it. I was never a threat to anything. You were a threat to his control over me, and my father doesn't tolerate threats. The pieces were starting to fit together in ways Ethan didn't like. Christopher Wells separating them made a certain cold logic. Rich fathers had been preventing unsuitable romances since the invention of social class. But the vehemence of it, the permanent severance, the complete elimination of contact suggested something more than simple snobbery. There's something else, he said, watching her face carefully. Something you're not telling me. Elena met his eyes, and in them he saw confirmation that he was right. There were layers to this story she hadn't revealed yet, secrets that went deeper than intercepted notes and class differences. But before she could respond, Marcus appeared in the garage doorway, expression apologetic. Ethan, Mrs. Patterson is here about her Civic. Says it's urgent. The moment shattered. Ethan stood grateful for the interruption, despite knowing it was also a reprieve for Elena, a chance to avoid whatever she'd been about to confess. I have to get back to work. Elena stood as well, smoother than he'd managed years of corporate meetings, making her graceful under pressure. Can we talk again tonight? Maybe there's more you need to know. Every instinct he'd developed over the past 12 years screamed at him to say no. To end this now before it went any further, before whatever she had to tell him disrupted the careful equilibrium of his life even more than it already had. But he found himself nodding anyway. The diner on Main Street, 7 o'clock. I'll have to bring Harper. Something that might have been gratitude flashed across Elena's face. Thank you. She left without trying to extend the conversation, without pushing for more than he'd offered, and Ethan watched her go with the unsettling sense that he'd just made a decision he couldn't unmake. That night alone in her hotel room after a day of merger meetings, she'd barely registered Elena sat surrounded by documents she'd spent the afternoon gathering. Coffee had gone cold in the paper cup at her elbow. The room service dinner she'd ordered sat untouched on the desk. Outside Burlington's modest downtown had settled into evening quiet, but her work was just beginning. Wells Industries maintained offices in Burlington ostensibly because of a manufacturing plant acquisition from decades ago. But the deeper Elena dug into company records, the more she realized how much business passed through those offices that had nothing to do with manufacturing. Legal files, personnel records, contracts that should have been processed through the New York headquarters, but somehow ended up here instead. Her father's fingerprints were all over the Burlington operation, and now that she was looking with fresh eyes instead of dutiful daughter blinders, the patterns became impossible to ignore. She'd started with the obvious, searching for any documentation about Ethan Morrison from 12 years ago, employment records, background checks, anything that might explain why Christopher Wells had been so determined to eliminate him from Elena's life. What she found was a single file buried in archived legal documents marked with a case number that meant nothing, until she cross-referenced it with Vermont court records. An accident investigation. 12 years ago, the same summer Elena had been forced back to New York. Elena's hands trembled as she opened the file. The initial police report was straightforward enough. A Wells Industries delivery truck had run a red light at the intersection of Maple and 4th, striking a civilian vehicle. 2 occupants in the civilian car, driver Ethan Morrison, age 23, and passenger Sarah Morrison, age 46. Sarah Morrison transported to Burlington Medical Center with multiple fractures and internal injuries. Driver Morrison uninjured but in shock. The delivery truck driver had tested clean for drugs and alcohol. Security camera footage from a nearby business confirmed the truck had entered the intersection against the light. Initial fault assessment placed 100% liability on Wells Industries. Then the report got complicated. Witness statements had been amended, not once but multiple times, each revision shifting more responsibility onto Ethan. The security footage had been reviewed by technical experts who determined it was inconclusive due to glare and poor angle. The timeline of events had been adjusted to suggest Ethan might have been traveling above the speed limit, might have been distracted, might have contributed to the collision even if he hadn't caused it outright. In the margins of one revision, Elena found a note in handwriting she recognized from years of reading her father's correspondence. Her blood went cold. CW wants this handled quietly. The boy needs to be discredited. She sat back, feeling like she might be sick. Christopher Wells. Her father had known about the accident, had known Ethan was innocent, and had actively worked to shift blame onto him anyway. But why? The lawsuit was settled. Wells Industries had paid out a substantial sum to Sarah Morrison for medical expenses and damages. The company could afford it. There was no financial incentive to destroy Ethan's reputation along with his mother's health. Unless the goal had never been about money. Elena pulled up her calendar, counting backward. The accident had happened 3 months after she'd been forced to leave Burlington. 3 months after Christopher had separated them. 3 months after Ethan would have received his scholarship confirmation from MIT. She opened her laptop and searched for Ethan's name combined with MIT. Found a news article from the school paper about that year's incoming engineering class. mentioning several scholarship recipients by name. Ethan Morrison had been listed among them past tense, the article noted in a brief update due to personal circumstances. The scholarship had been withdrawn. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The accident hadn't been random bad luck. It had been an opportunity. Christopher Wells had seen a chance to permanently eliminate the boy his daughter had been foolish enough to love, and he'd taken it. Had used company resources and influence to transform an innocent victim into someone tainted by scandal. Had destroyed Ethan's scholarship prospects, his reputation, his entire future with surgical precision. Because when that same boy had dared to love Christopher's daughter, the man had already decided Ethan Morrison needed to be removed from Elena's life by any means necessary. And when the universe handed him an accident involving a company truck, he'd weaponized it. Elena found more evidence as she dug deeper. Legal memos about managing liability exposure, internal emails discussing strategy for the case, recommendations from company attorneys about how to minimize financial and reputational damage to Wells Industries by shifting narrative focus onto the other driver, and underneath it all, Christopher's steady hand, guiding every decision, every revision, every carefully calibrated lie. Her father had destroyed an innocent man's future to protect corporate interests. And when that man had fallen in love with his daughter, Christopher had been ready to keep him destroyed to ensure they never reconnected, to guarantee that Ethan would be too damaged and too furious to ever welcome Elena back, even if she tried. The hotel room felt too small, suddenly the walls pressing in. Elena grabbed her phone and called the front desk. "I need to print documents. Do you have a business center?" 30 minutes later, she had physical copies of everything spread across her bed: police reports, witness statements, internal memos, email chains, a paper trail that proved exactly what her father had done and why. Tomorrow she would confront Christopher, would force him to explain how he could claim to love her while simultaneously destroying anyone she dared to love in return. But tonight she had to prepare for dinner with Ethan. Had to find a way to tell him that his worst suspicions about her family hadn't been nearly suspicious enough. That the accident that had derailed his entire life hadn't been random misfortune but calculated malice orchestrated by the same man who'd stolen Elena's note and ensured they spent 12 years believing the worst of each other. Sometimes the people you trusted most became the architects of your deepest pain. And sometimes discovering that truth arrived 12 years too late to fix the damage. The diner on Main Street had been serving the same menu since the 1970s, which meant the coffee was reliably terrible and the pie was reliably excellent. Ethan had been bringing Harper here since she was old enough to sit in a high chair, and she'd claimed the corner booth as theirs, with the territoriality of a 7-year-old who understood that routine meant safety. Tonight, though, they weren't alone. Elena sat across from them, looking profoundly out of place in her business casual among the vinyl booths and laminate tables. She'd ordered coffee but hadn't touched it, her attention focused entirely on Harper, who had produced a drawing from her backpack and was explaining it with the earnest intensity of someone describing quantum physics. "This is our house," Harper said, pointing to a lopsided rectangle with a triangle roof. "And this is Daddy's truck. And this is the garage where we work. And these are flowers because Daddy says we should plant flowers in the spring, but we haven't yet because we're too busy." Elena studied the drawing with what appeared to be genuine interest. "What kind of flowers will you plant?" "Sunflowers." Harper's whole face lit up. "The really tall ones that get taller than me. Daddy says they're easy to grow and the birds like them." "Your daddy's right. Sunflowers are beautiful." Ethan watched the interaction with complicated feelings he couldn't quite name. Harper was clearly charmed. She'd been skeptical when he'd explained that an old friend would be joining them for dinner. But Elena's careful attention and authentic responses had won her over in under 5 minutes. and Elena, for her part, had crouched down to Harper's eye level when they'd first arrived, shaking her hand with grave formality that suggested she understood how seriously children took such rituals. But underneath the pleasant small talk and Harper's chatter about school and flowers and the hermit crab her friend Maisie kept in a tank, Ethan could see tension in Elena's shoulders. She was waiting for Harper to be distracted for a moment when they could talk about things that weren't appropriate for 7-year-old ears. The waitress came by with their orders burgers for Ethan and Harper, a salad Elena had ordered mostly to have something to do with her hands. Harper immediately became absorbed in the serious business of organizing her fries by size, a ritual that would occupy her for at least 5 minutes. Elena leaned forward slightly, voice low. "I found something. About the accident. About what really happened." Ethan's burger turned to cardboard in his mouth. He forced himself to swallow, very aware of Harper 3 feet away, very conscious that whatever Elena was about to tell him would need to be conveyed in careful code. "Not here," he said quietly. "After dinner." She nodded, understanding, and they fell back into the safer pattern of including Harper in neutral conversation. But Ethan could feel the weight of unspoken revelations pressing down on the table, making everything taste slightly wrong, making his daughter's innocent joy feel fragile, in a way that made his chest tight. An hour later, with Harper occupied by crayons and a fresh placemat to color, Ethan and Elena stood outside the diner in the parking lot's dim light. Inside, Harper was visible through the window, tongue poking out in concentration as she drew what appeared to be the solar system, with highly inaccurate planetary proportions. Elena pulled a folder from her car, the kind of legal-sized document holder that lawyers used for important papers. "I spent the afternoon going through company archives, found files that should have been destroyed years ago, except someone understood the value of keeping insurance against powerful people." She handed him the folder. Ethan opened it to find police reports, witness statements, internal company memos. He skimmed the first few pages, his engineering-trained mind quickly parsing the data, identifying the pattern of revisions and alterations. When he looked up, his face had gone carefully blank. "Your father falsified the accident investigation." "Yes." "To make me look responsible." "Yes." The word was barely a whisper, but it carried 12 years of guilt and horror and dawning understanding of exactly what Christopher Wells was capable of when protecting his interests. Ethan flipped through more pages, reading the annotations, seeing his own name mentioned again and again in increasingly negative contexts. Witness statements that had originally cleared him completely revised to suggest uncertainty about his speed, his attention, his culpability. Technical analysis that had concluded the truck driver was entirely at fault, amended to note possible contributing factors from the other vehicle. And in the margins, in handwriting, Elena had identified as her father's instructions about how to manage the narrative, how to discredit the boy, how to ensure that even if criminal charges weren't filed, which they hadn't been, the taint of suspicion would follow Ethan Morrison for years. "MIT withdrew my scholarship," Ethan said, his voice hollow. "Not officially because of the accident, but I always knew that's why. Couldn't prove it. The school cited institutional concerns and recent developments in character assessment, but everyone knew what they meant." He looked at Elena directly, and she flinched from what she saw in his eyes. "Your father destroyed my future to cover up a company truck running a red light. To protect Wells Industries from a lawsuit, yes, but also—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "Also because you had already fallen in love with me by then. He knew about us, had known for weeks. This was his way of making sure that even if you tried to contact me, I would believe the worst when I heard about the accident." The implications sank in slowly. Christopher Wells hadn't just seized an opportunity. He'd weaponized a tragedy to permanently separate his daughter from an unsuitable romance, banking on the fact that Elena would hear about the accident and Ethan's alleged fault and assume he'd been reckless, dangerous someone she'd been lucky to escape. "Did you," Ethan asked, "believe the worst?" Elena's silence was answer enough. "I heard through friends," she finally said, "about the accident, about your mother's injuries, about MIT, and my father told me it happened because you were driving recklessly, that you'd always been the type to take dangerous chances, that I should be grateful I'd gotten out when I did." Tears streaked down her face, now unchecked. "And I believed him. God help me, I believed him because I couldn't imagine my own father would lie about something like that." Ethan closed the folder and handed it back to her, his movements precise and controlled in the way of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you deserve the truth. Because I spent 12 years thinking you'd chosen not to respond to my note when really you never got it. Because my father has taken enough from both of us and I won't let him take anything more." Her voice strengthened, some of the corporate steel returning beneath the grief. "And because I'm going to confront him. Tomorrow. Make him answer for what he's done. That won't change anything. Maybe not, but at least he'll know I know. At least he'll understand that his control over me is finished." They stood in the parking lot, silence, the weight of revelation hanging between them like smoke. Inside the diner, Harper waved at her father through the window, holding up her completed solar system drawing for approval. Ethan waved back automatically, his mind still processing everything Elena had told him. "I need to think," he said finally. I need time to think. I understand." But as she turned to go, Ethan found himself speaking again, the words coming from somewhere deep that he'd thought he'd locked away for good. "All these years I thought it was my fault. I thought I somehow caused the accident, that everyone who blamed me was right even when the official report cleared me. I carried that weight every single day." Elena stopped, turned back. The parking lot's overhead lights cast harsh shadows across her face, but her eyes were clear and direct. "You were innocent. You were always innocent, and I'm so sorry it took me this long to prove it." Something inside Ethan cracked then, not breaking entirely, but fracturing, letting light seep into places that had been dark for over a decade. He'd built his entire adult identity around being the guy who'd screwed up, who'd lost his chance, who'd had to rebuild from his own mistakes. Learning that those mistakes had never existed, that his suffering had been manufactured by someone else's malice. It was like finding out gravity had been optional all along. He turned away before the emotion could overwhelm him completely, bracing his hands against the hood of his truck, shoulders tight with tension. When Elena moved closer, not touching but near enough that he could feel her presence, he didn't pull away. "Why did you do this?" His voice came out rough. "You could have just walked away, pretended you never saw me in that parking lot. It would have been easier." Her answer came soft but certain. "I've spent 12 years taking the easy way, telling myself what happened was in the past, that there was nothing I could do to change it. But that was a lie. I could have fought for you back then, and I didn't. I was too scared of my father, too afraid of losing everything I thought I wanted." She stepped close enough that he could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive that didn't belong in a diner parking lot any more than she did. "I'm not scared anymore, and I'm not going to let fear keep me from doing what's right. Not ever again." Ethan turned to face her, searching her expression for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. But all he saw was raw honesty, the kind that came from finally stopping the lies you'd been telling yourself for years. The moment stretched, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Then Harper's voice floated through the diner's open door asking if it was time for pie yet, and reality reasserted itself. "I should get her home," Ethan said. "School night." "Of course." But as Elena walked to her car, Ethan called out one more time. "Elena." She paused, waiting. "Thank you for fighting. This time." The smile that broke across her face was worth every moment of discomfort this evening had brought. Fragile and hopeful and real in a way that reminded him exactly why he'd fallen for her in the first place. The next day, Elena arrived at her father's Burlington office, without an appointment, walking past the secretary's desk with the authority of someone who knew objections were pointless. Christopher Wells occupied the corner suite on the building's top floor, a space designed to intimidate with floor-to-ceiling windows and walls lined with awards celebrating decades of corporate success. He sat behind a desk that cost more than most people's cars. Silver hair, perfectly styled suit tailored to hide the slight softening that came with age and executive dining. When Elena entered, he looked up with the patient condescension of someone accustomed to winning every battle. "Elena, this is unexpected. Your meetings aren't scheduled until this afternoon." She closed the door behind her and placed the folder on his desk without preamble. "We need to talk about Ethan Morrison." Christopher's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition calculation, the instant assessment of how to spin this in his favor. "I don't know who that is." "Yes, you do. The mechanic's son I was seeing 12 years ago, the one whose accident you covered up to protect the company, the one whose future you destroyed because he had the audacity to fall in love with your daughter." Her father leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in a gesture she'd seen him use 1,000 times when preparing to deliver an unpleasant truth with maximum impact. "You're making accusations you can't prove." Elena flipped open the folder, revealing the documentation she'd gathered. Police reports, internal memos, emails, the entire paper trail of corporate malfeasance and personal vendetta. "I can prove every word. I've had these documents authenticated by independent experts. I've traced the timeline, talked to people you thought you'd silenced. Everything points to one conclusion: you destroyed an innocent man's life to cover up company negligence and prevent him from contaminating your daughter's future." For the first time in her memory, Elena saw uncertainty flash across her father's face. Not fear exactly, but awareness that she'd prepared more thoroughly than he'd anticipated, that this wasn't an emotional outburst he could dismiss with practiced talking points. "Going public with this would destroy us both," Christopher said, recovering his composure. "You'd lose your position at the company, your inheritance, everything you've worked for. You're throwing away your entire future for a man who means nothing." The words were meant to wound, meant to remind her of stakes and consequences and all the careful conditioning he'd installed over decades of molding her into the perfect heir. But they landed differently than he'd intended. Elena straightened, meeting her father's eyes with steel she hadn't known she possessed. "He doesn't mean nothing. He never did. And I'm not going to let you keep hurting him just because you can. You're being foolish. Emotion is clouding your judgment. You'll regret this for the rest of your life. What I regret is not standing up to you 12 years ago. What I regret is believing your lies about Ethan being reckless and dangerous. What I regret is every day I wasted thinking I had to choose between love and security when really I was just choosing between happiness and your approval." Christopher's face contorted with rage, the careful mask slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. "You ungrateful, after everything I've given you, everything I've built for you, you want to throw it away for some provincial mechanic and his bastard child." The slur against Harper snapped something fundamental inside Elena. She'd come here prepared to be reasonable, to negotiate some kind of resolution that didn't end in total war. But hearing her father dismiss an innocent 7-year-old as leverage in his power games burned away any remaining desire for compromise. That child has more love in her life than I ever received from you." Elena said, her voice deadly quiet. "That man is worth 10 of you. And yes, I'm throwing away everything you've built because it's all contaminated by the way you've used it as a weapon against anyone who threatens your control." She turned toward the door, done with this conversation, done with pretending her father's approval was something worth pursuing. But she paused at the threshold, looking back with an expression that held 12 years of accumulated clarity. "I'm done, Father. Done letting you decide who I am and who I'm allowed to love. You can keep your empire, keep your money, keep your precious control over everything except me, because from this moment forward, I choose him. I choose them. And there's nothing you can do to stop me." She walked out, leaving Christopher Wells alone with the documents that proved exactly what he was capable of when someone dared to defy him. Behind her, she heard him call her name, but she didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't give him any opening to deploy the manipulation tactics he'd perfected over decades of corporate warfare. Outside the building, she leaned against her car and let herself shake. Standing up to her father had been terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Like cutting a rope that had been both anchor and noose. She'd just sacrificed her career, her inheritance, probably any chance of reconciliation with the only family she had left. And she'd never felt freer in her life. That evening, Elena found Ethan at the garage after closing alone in the silent building with the lights dimmed and tools put away. He was sitting on the workbench staring at nothing, and when she entered, he looked up with red-rimmed eyes that suggested he'd been processing revelations in his own way. "I told him everything," she said without preamble. "About finding the files, about knowing what he did, about being done with letting him control my life." Ethan's expression remained guarded, but some of the rigid tension in his shoulders eased. "How did he take it?" "About as well as you'd expect. Threats, manipulation, reminders of everything I'd lose if I went against him." She moved closer, maintaining respectful distance, but wanting him to see her face when she said this next part. "He wanted me to believe you were nothing. Just some provincial mechanic who'd gotten lucky with my attention for a summer. Someone I should be grateful to have escaped." "And what do you believe?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. This was the moment Elena understood where she either committed fully or retreated to safety, where she chose the comfortable lie or the dangerous truth. "I believe that walking away from you 12 years ago was the worst mistake I ever made. I believe that my father destroyed your future because he couldn't stand the idea that I'd chosen someone based on character instead of pedigree. I believe that you deserved so much better than what happened to you from him, from me, from everyone who should have protected you instead of using you as a sacrifice to corporate liability." She took a breath, steadying herself. "And I believe that if you let me, I'd like to spend whatever time you're willing to give me trying to make up for even a fraction of the damage my family has caused." Ethan studied her face in the dim light, searching for something she hoped he'd find. When he finally spoke, his voice carried exhaustion rather than anger. "I don't know if I can trust you. I want to, but I don't know if I remember how to trust anyone except Harper and Marcus. I know. And I can't let you disrupt her life. She's been through enough with her mother leaving. I won't let anyone else make promises they can't keep." "I understand." They sat in silence for a long moment, the garage settling around them with the particular quiet of a space designed for work now empty of purpose. Finally, Ethan slid off the workbench and crossed to where she stood. He didn't touch her, didn't close the distance entirely, just looked at her with an expression that held 12 years of pain and caution, and the faintest glimmer of something that might eventually become hope. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not being scared anymore, about doing what's right even when it's hard." Elena waited, barely breathing. I think I've been scared too for a long time. Scared of letting anyone in. Scared of getting hurt again. Scared of believing that good things could actually happen to people like me. He paused and something shifted behind his eyes, some decision being made in real time. But I'm tired of being scared. I'm tired of letting the past dictate my future. He reached out then, just his hand, palm up in offering. Elena took it, feeling the calluses from years of honest work, the strengthened fingers that could coax life from broken engines and tenderness from fractured hearts. They didn't kiss, didn't make grand declarations or promises neither was ready to keep. Just stood there in the darkening garage, holding hands like teenagers, acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, some broken things could be repaired if you had the right tools and enough patience and the willingness to believe that damage wasn't always permanent. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan let Elena into his life in careful increments. Coffee at the diner where Harper could run around and the stakes felt lower. Walks through the park on Sunday afternoons, help with grocery shopping that turned into Elena teaching Harper how to pick ripe avocados while Ethan watched with bemused affection. One Saturday, Elena arrived at the house with supplies for the sunflower garden Harper had been dreaming about. They spent the afternoon digging holes and planting seeds while Harper narrated an elaborate story about how the flowers would grow so tall they'd reach the moon. "She likes you," Ethan said that evening after Harper had gone to bed, the two of them sitting on the porch in comfortable quiet. "That's not easy. She's been through a lot." Elena understood what he wasn't saying directly. Harper had learned early that people left. Her mother had vanished when she was barely more than a toddler. The kid had every reason to protect herself against adults who might make promises they couldn't keep. "Her father doesn't trust easily either," Elena said carefully. Ethan acknowledged the point with a slight nod. They were both learning to navigate this fragile new thing between them, this tentative reconstruction of connection after 12 years of absence. Some days it felt almost easy, like slipping back into comfortable rhythms they'd established long ago. Other days, the weight of everything that had happened, the separation, the lies, the lost years, pressed down so heavily that Elena wondered if the damage was too extensive for repair. But she kept showing up, and Ethan kept letting her. One evening at the diner, after Harper had run off to the bathroom, Ethan leaned across the table and spoke quietly. "I never thought I'd feel this again. Hope, I mean. The sense that maybe the future could be different than the past." Elena reached across and took his hand, the gesture now familiar enough that it didn't startle either of them. "Then let's stop being scared together. Let's see what happens when we actually give this a real chance." He didn't answer immediately, but when Harper returned to the table chattering about the drawings someone had left on the bathroom mirror in soap, he didn't let go of Elena's hand, just adjusted his grip slightly, making room for both connections in his life. The daughter who'd saved him from despair and the woman who represented a possibility he'd thought permanently lost. It was Marcus who noticed the change first. 3 weeks after Elena's reappearance, he cornered Ethan in the garage office with the direct approach of someone who'd earned the right to speak plainly. "You're different lately. Lighter, somehow." Ethan didn't bother denying it. Marcus had been around too long, seen too much, understood Ethan's patterns too well for deflection to work. We've been spending time together. Her and Harper and me. The woman from the parking lot. Yeah." Marcus absorbed this information with the careful neutrality of someone reserving judgment. "She the reason you looked like you'd seen a ghost that day? She's the reason for a lot of things. She planning to stick around, or is this another summer thing that ends when reality kicks back in?" The question was fair, even if it hurt. Ethan had been asking himself the same thing, trying to reconcile the Elena he remembered with the corporate executive who'd appeared in expensive suits and luxury cars. trying to figure out if someone who'd been raised in penthouses could really build a life in a town where the biggest excitement was the county fair. She quit her job, Ethan said, confronted her father about what he did to me to us, walked away from the company, the inheritance, everything. He met Marcus's eyes directly. I think she's serious about staying. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Just be careful, kid. Harper's already getting attached. If this woman disappears again, it won't just be you picking up the pieces. The warning was unnecessary. Ethan had been hyper-aware of Harper's growing affection for Elena. The way his daughter lit up when Elena arrived, the casual way she'd started including Miss Elena in her plans for the future. It terrified him and gave him hope in equal measure, the possibility that they could be more than just father and daughter, that they could be something like a family. But then 10 miles across town in an office, Ethan had never seen Christopher Wells was making plans of his own. Plans that involved private investigators and careful research into every vulnerability Ethan Morrison might have. Plans that would test exactly how far Elena was willing to go to protect the new life she was trying to build. Because men like Christopher Wells didn't accept defeat gracefully. And they definitely didn't let their daughters choose mechanics over empires without making everyone involved pay the price. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while Ethan was replacing brake pads on a Subaru that had been making concerning noises for the past 2 weeks. His phone buzzed in his pocket and he almost ignored it. Customers could wait 5 minutes while he finished torquing the wheel lugs to spec, but something made him check the caller ID. Burlington Medical Center. His stomach dropped. He answered with grease-stained fingers, already moving toward the office where he could hear without the bay's echo. The voice on the other end was professional, clinical, asking if he was the primary contact for Sarah Morrison. His mother had collapsed at the grocery store. Paramedics were bringing her in. No, they couldn't provide details over the phone. Yes, he should come immediately. The drive to the hospital blurred past in fragments, Marcus promising to watch Harper after school, the highway stretching endlessly despite being only 6 miles, the antiseptic smell of the emergency room waiting area that brought back memories of 12 years ago when he'd sat in these same chairs waiting to learn if his mother would walk again. Sarah was stable by the time they let him see her. Conscious, embarrassed, insisting the whole thing was an overreaction, and she'd just gotten lightheaded from skipping lunch. But the doctor who pulled Ethan aside told a different story. The injuries from the accident 12 years ago had left Sarah with chronic pain that had progressively worsened. She'd been managing it with over-the-counter medication and sheer stubbornness, refusing to acknowledge that the damage went deeper than anyone had initially understood. Now her body was giving out under the accumulated strain, nerve damage, arthritis in joints that had been shattered, and imperfectly healed muscle deterioration from years of compensating for impaired mobility. She needs specialized treatment, the doctor said, pulling up scans that showed Ethan's mother's spine in alarming detail. Physical therapy, probably surgery to address the nerve compression. Pain management from specialists, not whatever she's been buying at the drugstore. Without intervention, she's looking at wheelchair dependency within 2 years. The estimated cost made Ethan's vision swim. Even with insurance, the out-of-pocket expenses would be catastrophic. Tens of thousands initially, then ongoing costs that would bleed him dry within months. The garage was doing okay, but okay didn't cover medical emergencies of this magnitude. He had Harper's college fund carefully accumulated over 7 years. He had a small savings account for unexpected repairs. He had equity in the house if he wanted to refinance and gamble that he could keep up with higher payments. None of it would be enough. He sat with his mother in her hospital room after the doctor left, watching her pretend to sleep while tears leaked from the corners of her closed eyes. Sarah Morrison had raised him alone after his father died, had worked 2 jobs to keep them fed and housed, had celebrated every small victory and weathered every setback with quiet strength. And now she was lying in a hospital bed facing pain and disability because a Wells Industries truck driver had run a red light 12 years ago. And Christopher Wells had decided covering up company negligence mattered more than justice. Ethan's phone buzzed with a text from Elena asking if he wanted to bring Harper by for the pasta dinner they'd planned. He stared at the message, then at his mother's drawn face, then back at the phone. Elena, whose father had caused this, whose family money could solve this problem with a single check that wouldn't even dent their accounts. The thought arrived fully formed and poisonous. He could ask her, could explain the situation and let her feel obligated to help to use Wells' money to fix Wells' damage. Could let her father's wealth become the solution to the crisis her father had created. He deleted the text without responding and pocketed the phone. Some problems couldn't be solved by accepting help from the people who'd caused them in the first place. 3 days later, Sarah was released from the hospital with prescriptions she couldn't afford and referrals to specialists whose waiting lists stretched months into the future. Ethan helped her into his truck with the careful movements of someone handling something precious and breakable, and they drove back to her small house in silence, heavy with everything neither of them knew how to say. He'd just gotten her settled on the couch with pillows and the television remote when the doorbell rang. Sarah's expression went carefully neutral in a way that immediately put Ethan on alert. "I should get that," she said, starting to rise. "Stay put, I'll handle it." But when he opened the door, the man standing on the porch wasn't selling anything or collecting for charity. He was 50-something, expensive suit, leather briefcase, the kind of polished professional who charged by the quarter hour and expected people to be grateful for his time. "Ethan Morrison. My name is David Garrett. I'm an attorney representing a client who wishes to help with your mother's medical situation." The words landed like stones in still water, their implications rippling outward in patterns Ethan didn't like. "I don't know what you're talking about." Garrett smiled with practiced sympathy. "May I come in? This conversation would be better conducted privately." Every instinct Ethan had developed over 12 years of people trying to take advantage of him screamed danger. But his mother was calling from the living room asking who it was, and the lawyer was already stepping forward with the presumption of someone accustomed to doors opening for him. Inside, Garrett settled into the armchair across from Sarah with the ease of a man comfortable in any setting. He opened his briefcase and extracted documents that Ethan recognized even before seeing the letterhead. Medical records, cost estimates, the entire financial nightmare laid out in black and white. "My client has been made aware of Mrs. Morrison's medical needs." Garrett began, his tone conveying both concern and inevitability. "They wish to cover all treatment costs, including the surgery, ongoing therapy, and medication. No strings attached, no repayment expected. Simply an acknowledgement that your family deserves better than what happened 12 years ago." Sarah's face had gone pale. Ethan's had gone hard as concrete. "Who's your client?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information without Mrs. Morrison's agreement to the terms." "Then you can leave." But Sarah spoke before Garrett could respond. Her voice thin but determined. "Christopher Wells sent you, didn't he?" The lawyer's expression confirmed what Ethan's gut had already known. This was Christopher's play. His way of buying silence, of ensuring that Elena's newfound defiance didn't translate into actual consequences, of reminding everyone involved that Wells' money could solve any problem as long as you were willing to accept the terms. "Mr. Wells wishes only to help," Garrett said smoothly. He recognizes that his company bore responsibility for the accident, and while the legal settlement at the time was adequate, he feels a moral obligation to address ongoing complications. The translation was clear enough. Take the money, shut up about the falsified investigation, let Elena come crawling back to Daddy once she realized that pride didn't pay for medical care. Ethan stood his movement sharp enough to make Garrett flinch. Get out. Mr. Morrison, I understand your hesitation, but your mother's health... My mother's health is none of Christopher Wells's business. Nothing about our lives is his business. You can tell your client that we don't want his guilt money or his manipulation disguised as generosity. Garrett's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing calculation underneath. Mrs. Morrison is the one who needs treatment. Perhaps she should be the one making this decision. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Sarah needed help that Ethan couldn't provide. She was an adult capable of making her own choices. If she wanted to accept Wells' money to avoid years of deteriorating pain, what right did her son have to prevent it? Ethan looked at his mother, seeing in her face the same stubborn pride that had gotten them through his father's death, through the accident, through every crisis that had tried to break them. She met his eyes and gave a tiny shake of her head. I think my son made our position clear, Sarah said, her voice stronger now. Please leave. Garrett gathered his papers with the stiff movements of someone unaccustomed to rejection. At the door, he turned back with a final card to play. The offer remains open for 1 week. After that, my client will consider the matter closed. I hope you'll reconsider for Mrs. Morrison's sake. Medical emergencies have a way of forcing difficult choices. Then he was gone, leaving behind a business card on the entry table and the acrid taste of threats delivered with perfect legal deniability. Sarah spoke first, her voice cracking. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I should have told you. He'd contacted me before, called last week, said he wanted to help. I told him no then too, but I guess he thought trying in person would work better. Ethan sat beside her on the couch, his mind already calculating and recalculating numbers that wouldn't add up no matter how he arranged them. We'll figure something out. I can refinance the house, maybe take a loan against the business. No. Sarah gripped his hand with surprising strength. You're not destroying your financial future because that man decided 12 years ago that covering up corporate negligence was more important than doing the right thing. Then what do we do? The question hung unanswered between them, heavy with the impossible mathematics of medical care in America, where choosing between pain and bankruptcy shouldn't have been a choice anyone had to make. Elena found out about Sarah's collapse from Harper of all people. They were planting more seeds in the garden tomatoes this time. Harper's request after learning you could grow your own spaghetti sauce. When the little girl mentioned with 7-year-old casualness that Grandma Sarah had gone to the hospital but was home now, and Daddy seemed really worried even though he said everything was fine. The words stopped Elena mid-motion, trowel suspended over the dirt. When did this happen? Thursday. Daddy had to leave work early and Marcus picked me up from school. Then Daddy was on the phone a lot and forgot to read me a story at bedtime. Harper's expression turned thoughtful. He only forgets stories when something's really wrong. Elena's mind was already racing through implications. Thursday was 3 days ago. 3 days Ethan hadn't mentioned anything, hadn't asked for help, hadn't reached out despite the fact that they'd been building something that felt increasingly like trust. Because he didn't trust her. Not really. Not enough to let her into the hard parts, the places where real life intruded on whatever careful reconstruction they'd been attempting. Or worse possibility, because he knew that asking her for help would mean accepting Wells' money to solve a Wells-created problem, and his pride wouldn't bend that far. She finished planting with Harper. praised the careful way the girl patted soil around each seedling, then made excuses about needing to handle work calls. In her car, she pulled up everything she could find about Sarah Morrison's medical history, using contacts from her corporate days who owed her favors and didn't ask too many questions about why. What she found made her feel physically sick. Sarah's ongoing medical issues stemmed directly from injuries sustained in the accident 12 years ago. The settlement Wells Industries had paid had covered immediate expenses but hadn't anticipated long-term complications. Now Sarah needed treatment that would cost more than most people earned in 2 years, and Ethan was probably trying to figure out how to sell everything he owned to afford it. Because her father had decided destroying Ethan Morrison was worth whatever collateral damage it caused. Elena sat in her parked car outside Ethan's house, watching through the kitchen window. As he helped Harper with homework, his movements carrying the particular exhaustion of someone holding too much weight alone. She could walk in there right now. Could offer to pay for Sarah's treatment, use the money from her grandmother's trust fund that her father couldn't touch, solve this problem the way money was supposed to solve problems for people who had enough of it. But Ethan would refuse. Would see it as charity from the family that had destroyed his mother's health in the first place. Would interpret generosity as obligation, would let pride and justified anger prevent him from accepting help even when the alternative was watching his mother suffer. Unless Elena made it impossible for him to refuse. Unless she removed the complication of Wells' money by removing herself from the Wells family entirely. She pulled out her phone and dialed her father's private number. He answered on the second ring, his tone carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who'd been expecting this call. "Elena, have you come to your senses? I need you to do something for me." Christopher's laugh was dry, humorless. "You're not in a position to make demands, darling. You walked away, remember? Chose the mechanic over the empire. I believe your exact words were something about me not being able to control you anymore. The inheritance from Grandma Catherine, the trust fund she set up. You can't touch that legally, but you can make my life difficult if I try to access it. File challenges, tie it up in court, drag things out until I'm buried in legal fees. I could do that, yes. What's your point?" Elena took a breath, steadying herself for the leap she was about to take. "I'm signing it over. All of it. $2 million give or take, depending on how the investments have done. I'm putting it in a medical trust for Sarah Morrison to cover her treatment costs and ongoing care." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Elena checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When Christopher finally spoke, his voice had gone cold in a way that meant she'd genuinely surprised him. "You're giving away your entire inheritance for that woman for them. I'm using money Grandma left me to fix damage your company caused. Seems appropriate. I could still contest it, could tie you up in litigation for years. By the time the court sorted it out, that woman would be in a wheelchair or worse." "You could," Elena agreed. "But you won't, because I'm going to make you an offer you'll actually want to accept." She could almost hear him calculating, trying to figure out what leverage she thought she had. "I'm listening. Let me access the trust fund cleanly, no challenges, no delays. Let me set up the medical account for Sarah Morrison without interference. In exchange, I won't go to the press with the evidence I have about the accident cover-up. Won't file complaints with the state attorney general. Won't pursue any of the dozen different legal avenues I've researched for holding Wells Industries accountable for corporate malfeasance and falsifying government records." The threat was bigger than anything she'd deployed before. Going public with the accident documents wouldn't just damage her father personally. It would open Wells Industries to criminal investigation, potential prosecution, civil liability from other cases where the company might have pulled similar manipulations. It would be scorched earth, and Christopher knew she had the evidence to make it stick. "You'd destroy the company your grandfather built, put thousands of people out of work, ruin your own reputation in the process, all for some mechanic's mother. I'd do it to stop you from using money as a weapon against people who can't fight back. I'd do it to prove that some things matter more than quarterly earnings and family legacy. Elena's voice strengthened, carrying certainty she felt all the way to her bones. And yes, I'd do it for them, because they're worth more than anything you've ever built. Another long silence. Then quietly, almost respectfully, you've changed. I've stopped letting fear make my decisions. There's a difference. Christopher exhaled, and in that sound, Elena heard something she'd never expected from her father: acknowledgement of defeat. Fine. Take your grandmother's money. Set up your medical trust. Help your mechanic's mother with Wells money that won't technically be Wells money. Salve your conscience however you need to. And you'll leave them alone. No more lawyers, no more offers, no more manipulation. I'll leave them alone. Christopher agreed, and Elena heard genuine weariness underneath the words. You've made your choice abundantly clear. I won't waste resources trying to change your mind. Thank you. Don't thank me, Elena. You've just given up millions of dollars and any claim to the family business for people who may not even appreciate the sacrifice. In 10 years, when you're struggling to pay bills and wondering what happened to your comfortable life, remember that this was your choice. Elena ended the call without responding to that particular poison. Her father's vision of the future, where money equaled happiness and sacrifice equaled regret, was one she'd stopped believing in the moment Ethan Morrison had looked at his daughter with love that didn't come with conditions. The next morning, she met with attorneys to expedite the trust fund transfer. By afternoon, she had documentation proving that Sarah Morrison would receive comprehensive medical care funded through an irrevocable trust that Elena had established, and then immediately resigned from controlling. By evening, she was driving to Ethan's house with a folder full of papers, and no idea how to explain what she'd done without making it sound like charity or obligation or any of the dozen wrong motivations that would make him refuse. She found him in the garage behind his house, working on the truck's transmission in the fading light, with the kind of focused intensity that meant he was using work to avoid thinking about harder problems. He didn't notice her approach until she was close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes that spoke of too many nights without sleep. We need to talk, she said. Ethan straightened, wiping his hands on a rag in that habitual gesture she'd come to recognize as his way of buying time to think. If this is about dinner, I'm sorry I've been distant. Things have been complicated. I know about your mother, about the medical costs, about the lawyer Christopher sent. His expression went carefully blank. Harper told you. She mentioned your mom was in the hospital. I found out the rest on my own. Elena held up the folder. And before you tell me this isn't my business or that you don't need help, I want you to know that I've already handled it. The money's in a trust for your mother's care. You can't refuse it because technically it's not mine anymore. I've signed over all control to independent trustees whose only job is to ensure Sarah gets the treatment she needs. Ethan stared at her like she'd started speaking a foreign language. What are you talking about? My grandmother left me money that my father couldn't touch. I used it to set up a medical fund for your mom. She'll have full coverage for surgery, therapy, medication, whatever she needs. No strings, no obligations, no Wells family involvement beyond the initial funding. How much money? All of it. Everything my grandmother left me. About $2 million, which should be more than enough for comprehensive care plus a safety net for future needs. The number seemed to hit Ethan physically. He took a step back, shaking his head. No, absolutely not. You can't just, that's your inheritance, your financial security. You can't give that away for my mother. I can, and I did. The paperwork's already filed. It's done. Then undo it. His voice rose, carrying an edge of panic that made Elena's chest ache. Call your lawyers back and tell them you changed your mind. That money is supposed to be yours for your future, for what? Buying things I don't need to fill spaces that will never be full, building a life that looks successful from the outside while feeling empty inside. Elena moved closer, needing him to see her face when she said this. I've spent 12 years living that life, Ethan, making choices based on fear and obligation and what my father thought was appropriate. And I'm done. I'm done letting money dictate what matters. I'm done accepting that some people deserve help and others should just suffer because of arbitrary decisions about who's worth saving. Ethan's jaw worked, emotions chasing across his face too fast to catalog. You barely know my mother. You've met her, twice, and you're giving up millions of dollars to help her. I'm using money I inherited to fix damage my family caused. That's not charity, that's basic human decency. It's more than that, and you know it. He was pacing now, agitation making him restless. This is you trying to fix everything, trying to make up for your father's sins by sacrificing yourself. But you can't save me, Elena. Can't erase 12 years with a check, no matter how big. The words stung, but Elena refused to flinch from them. I'm not trying to save you. I'm trying to stop the people I love from having to choose between bankruptcy and watching someone suffer. There's a difference. The people you love. Ethan repeated, his voice going quiet. You've been back in my life less than a month. How can you possibly? I loved you 12 years ago. Elena cut him off, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Loved you enough that losing you broke something in me I never quite put back together. And I've spent the past 4 weeks falling in love with you all over again. With who you've become, with the father you are, with the way you rebuild broken things and refuse to give up even when everything's stacked against you. She took a breath. So yes, I love you. And yes, I love your daughter and your mother and this life you've built that doesn't need my money but deserves not to be destroyed by mine. Ethan had stopped pacing. He stood utterly still, staring at her like he was seeing her for the first time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was raw. You can't love me. You don't even know me anymore. I know you won't accept help because you think needing people makes you weak. I know you read Harper the same bedtime story every night because routine makes her feel safe. I know you still blame yourself for the accident even though you have proof now that it wasn't your fault. I know you hide how much you're hurting because you think being strong means never admitting when something's too heavy to carry alone. Elena closed the distance between them until they were barely a foot apart. I know you're terrified I'll leave again. And I know that no matter what I say, you won't really believe I'm staying until I prove it with time and consistency and showing up even when it's hard. For a long moment, Ethan just looked at her, his defenses visibly crumbling under the weight of everything she'd said. When he finally moved, it was to pull her into his arms with the desperate intensity of someone who'd been holding himself together through sheer willpower and had finally hit the breaking point. I don't know how to do this, he said into her hair, his voice muffled but audible. Don't know how to trust that this is real. That you won't wake up one day and realize you gave up everything for a life that's too small and too ordinary and nothing like what you're supposed to have. Elena wrapped her arms around him, holding tight. What I'm supposed to have is a life that means something. People who matter more than profit margins. A chance to be someone worth being instead of just someone worth impressing. She pulled back enough to see his face. I don't want the life I'm supposed to have. I want this one. With you, with Harper, with the garage and the small town and all of it. Ethan searched her face like he was looking for the lie, the hidden motive, the inevitable disappointment. But whatever he found there made something fundamental shift in his expression. I love you too, he said, and the words came out like a confession he'd been holding back for fear they'd make him too vulnerable. I tried not to. Tried to keep you at a distance where you couldn't hurt me again. But I love you, and it terrifies me. Good, Elena said. Fear means you care enough to risk something. And I'd rather have your fear than your indifference. This time when he kissed her, it wasn't tentative or careful. It was 12 years of wanting and losing and finding again, all compressed into a single moment that felt like coming home after the longest exile. They broke apart, breathless foreheads pressed together, both of them shaking slightly from the intensity of finally admitting what had been building since that parking lot encounter. Your father's going to be furious, Ethan said eventually. My father's going to have to learn to live with disappointment. I'm done making my life small to fit his expectations. And when the money runs out, when you're living on a mechanic's salary instead of corporate executive income. Elena smiled against his shoulder. Then I guess I'll have to find a job. I hear there's a garage in town that might need someone to handle the business side. Think the owner would be interested. Despite everything, Ethan laughed. He might be, though the benefits package is pretty terrible. I don't know. I've seen the owner's daughter. She makes excellent drawings and knows all about sunflowers. That's a pretty significant benefit right there. They stood there in the cooling evening, holding each other while the sky went purple and the first stars emerged. Inside the house, Harper was probably wondering where her father had gone. In her own house across town, Sarah Morrison would need to be told about the trust fund and given the chance to accept or refuse it on her own terms. There were lawyers to call and paperwork to finalize and a dozen practical considerations that would need addressing. But for this moment in this garage that smelled of motor oil and possibility, Ethan Morrison and Elena Wells allowed themselves to believe that sometimes broken things could be repaired. That sometimes the people who'd hurt you weren't the ones who defined you. That sometimes choosing love over security was the only sane choice anyone could make. 6 months later, the sunflowers Harper had planted stretched toward the sky, their massive heads heavy with seeds that would carry forward into next year's garden. The cottage had been painted, the fence repaired, the garden expanded to include tomatoes and peppers and herbs that Elena had researched for Vermont's growing season. Sarah Morrison moved with less pain than she'd experienced in over a decade. The surgery and subsequent therapy funded by the trust Elena had established, having given her back mobility most people took for granted. She visited twice a week, bringing cookies for Harper and gratitude she still struggled to articulate for the woman who'd sacrificed millions to help someone she barely knew. The garage had expanded too, adding a second bay and hiring another mechanic to handle the increased business that came from word of mouth about honest work at fair prices. Elena managed the books and scheduling with the same competence she'd once applied to corporate mergers, discovering that helping a small business thrive felt infinitely more satisfying than shuffling money between accounts to maximize shareholder value. And Harper, 7 going on 30, had declared that this was the best year of her entire life. Because now she had a mom who knew about flowers and a grandma who wasn't hurting, and a dad who smiled more than he frowned. On a Saturday morning in early autumn, with leaves just beginning to turn and the air carrying the first hints of coming cold, Ethan found Elena in the garden harvesting the last of the tomatoes before frost could claim them. She was wearing jeans and one of his old work shirts. Her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dirt under her fingernails and satisfaction in her eyes. He watched her for a moment from the porch, this woman who'd given up everything to be here, who'd chosen a modest life in a small town over empire and wealth and everything Christopher Wells had assumed his daughter would always prioritize. She'd proven her father wrong about what mattered, and in doing so had proven to Ethan that trust wasn't something you lost forever. It was something you could rebuild if you had the right materials and enough patience. Harper was at a friend's house for a sleepover. Sarah had plans with her book club. Marcus had promised to handle any garage emergencies that might arise. It was just the two of them for the first time in weeks, and Ethan had been carrying a small box in his pocket for the past month, waiting for the right moment. He decided the right moment was now. When Elena looked happy instead of perfect, when she was covered in garden dirt instead of designer clothes, when she was exactly herself instead of any version someone else expected her to be. She looked up as he approached, smiling in that way that still made his chest tight. "Hey, I'm almost done. Want to help me carry these inside?" "In a minute. First, I need to ask you something." Something in his tone made her straighten, brush dirt off her hands, give him her full attention. "Okay, what's up?" Ethan pulled the box from his pocket, watching her eyes widen as she recognized what it meant. The ring inside was simple, nothing like what someone of Elena's former status would have expected. But it was honest, bought with money he'd earned, representing a future they'd build together instead of one imposed by family expectation. "I never thought I'd feel this again." He said the words coming easier than he'd anticipated. "Hope, love, the certainty that tomorrow could be better than today, you gave that back to me. Gave me back the ability to believe that good things could happen to people like us if we were brave enough to fight for them." Elena's eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. "Ethan, let me finish, please." He took a breath. "Will you marry me? Will you be Harper's mother? Will you build this life with me, even though it's nothing like what you were raised for, even though it's small and ordinary and probably harder than anything you've ever done?" She was nodding before he finished, tears spilling over, but her voice steady. "Yes, yes to all of it. Yes to you and Harper and this life and everything that comes with it." He slid the ring onto her finger, and when they kissed, it tasted like garden dirt and tears and the particular sweetness of promises made freely instead of under obligation. When they finally pulled apart, Elena laughed, the sound pure joy. "I should call my father. Tell him the mechanic just proposed with a ring I'm betting cost less than the dinners he used to expense. Will he be horrified? Probably. But you know what, his opinion stopped mattering the day I chose this." She gestured to encompass the garden, the house, the life they were building together. "Besides, he was wrong about something important." "What's that?" Elena's expression went soft, carrying truths that had taken her 12 years and several kinds of loss to understand. "He always said that power was about having the ability to do whatever you wanted. But real power, the kind that actually changes things, that's about knowing when to stop. When to choose people over profit, love over legacy, connection over control." The words settled between them with the weight of wisdom earned rather than inherited. Ethan pulled her close again, breathing in the scent of tomato plants and Elena's shampoo and the autumn air that promised change. "Your father also said you'd regret choosing me." "My father says a lot of things, doesn't make them true." They walked back to the house, hand in hand. Elena's engagement ring catching the light, both of them already planning how to tell Harper that her family was about to become official. Inside, the answering machine would be blinking with a message from Christopher Wells, a single sentence, acknowledging the trust fund arrangement and nothing more. The closest thing to approval Elena would probably ever receive from a man who'd spent her entire life trying to control outcomes he couldn't accept. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight was for celebration, for calling friends with good news, for imagining the wedding they'd planned together with Harper's enthusiastic help and Sarah's quiet blessing. Tonight was for believing that sometimes the best stories were the ones where you lost everything you thought you wanted and found everything you actually needed. 6 more months after that, Elena stood in the small church on Main Street wearing a simple dress that had cost 1/10 of what her father had spent on her debutante gown. Harper stood beside her in a flower girl dress she'd picked out herself, fidgeting with excitement. Sarah Morrison sat in the front row dabbing at tears while Marcus served as best man with the gruff pride of someone who'd watched Ethan rebuild himself and was fiercely glad to see him happy. The ceremony was brief, personal, focused on promises that actually meant something instead of pageantry designed to impress people neither of them cared about. When the pastor pronounced them married and Ethan kissed his bride, the assembled crowd was small but genuine garage customers and Harper's teachers and people who'd known the Morrisons for years. All of them thrilled to witness this particular happy ending. At the reception in Marcus's backyard with string lights and homemade food and music from a playlist Harper had carefully curated, Elena danced with her new husband while their daughter spun in circles nearby, dizzy with joy and cake. "Any regrets?" Ethan asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Elena looked around at the modest celebration, the simple decorations, the life she'd chosen that looked nothing like the one she'd been trained for. "Not even one. Your father didn't come. I didn't invite him. Some bridges are better burned than maintained." Ethan spun her gently and she caught Harper's eye as the girl twirled nearby. Their daughter, because that's what Harper had become legally and emotionally and in every way that counted, waved enthusiastically and Elena waved back, her wedding ring glinting. "You know what the best part is?" Elena said as the song shifted to something slower. "All those years I spent chasing what I was supposed to want, building a life that looked successful from outside while feeling hollow inside. I thought that was just how adult life worked, that everyone felt that persistent emptiness and just learned to ignore it. And now I wake up in a house that needs new gutters and a daughter who wants pancakes for breakfast and a husband who leaves grease stains on the bathroom towel. And I've never been happier in my entire life." She pressed closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Turns out home isn't where you were born or where you were raised or where someone else thinks you belong. Home is where you finally stop running." The words hung in the evening air, joining the laughter and music and sound of people celebrating love that had survived separation and lies and 12 years of believing the worst. Somewhere in New York, Christopher Wells was probably reviewing quarterly reports and calculating profit margins and never understanding that the greatest wealth his daughter would ever possess couldn't be measured in dollars or inherited through trusts or protected by lawyers. But Elena understood, standing in Marcus's backyard, with motor oil still faintly visible under her husband's nails, and their daughter's laughter ringing through the autumn evening. She understood perfectly. Some things you had to lose before you could find them. Some people came into your life twice, separated by years and pain and lessons that could only be learned through absence. Some families you built yourself from spare parts and second chances, and the stubborn refusal to accept that broken things stayed broken forever. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you got to discover that love wasn't something that happened to you once and never again. It was something you chose and fought for and earned through showing up even when it was hard. Even when it cost you everything you thought you wanted, even when it meant admitting that the life you were supposed to live would never be as good as the one you chose for yourself. The music played on. The stars emerged above Burlington, Vermont, unchanged witnesses to all the human drama that unfolded beneath them. And in a backyard decorated with string lights and simple flowers, Ethan and Elena Morrison held each other close, surrounded by everyone who mattered, building the kind of happiness that couldn't be bought or inherited or taken away by men who thought money equaled power. Because in the end, the only power that truly changed anything was the courage to choose love over fear, connection over control, and the uncertain beauty of an authentic life over the empty comfort of someone else's expectations. Harper ran up to them, breathless and grinning. "Can we do the cake now, please?" Elena laughed and took her daughter's hand. "Absolutely, lead the way." And as they walked together toward the table where Sarah Morrison was already cutting slices, 3 generations bound by choice rather than obligation, Elena caught her husband's eye and saw reflected there the same truth she carried in her own heart. They were finally completely impossibly home.